15,800 years ago, in what is now Turkey, someone fed a dogfish. Not a wolf, a dog. This is the oldest direct genetic evidence we have for a domestic dog anywhere on Earth, and it comes from a world with no farms, no villages, no bread, thousands of years before anyone pushed a single seed into the ground. You know the animal at your feet, the one that hears your key in the door from 3 rooms away. What you don't know is how old it is, not the dog lying there, the idea of the dog, the whole arrangement between your species and that one. What was life like for ancient dogs? The honest answer is that it was already deep, already braided into ours, long before the parts of human life we think of as civilization. By at least 14,300 years ago, dogs were not some local experiment in one lucky valley. Their genomes show one connected population stretched clear across Europe and Anatolia, the same animal running from the Atlantic coast to the Turkish highlands, all of it a single family. Before agriculture, before cities, before writing. The dog was already everywhere we were. You can measure that spread with 2 bones. One is the dog in Turkey, the other sits in a cave in Britain, a place called Gough's Cave, and it dates to that same 14,300 years. 2 dogs, nearly 2,000 miles apart, at opposite ends of a continent, and their genes say they belong to one and the same widespread population. Not cousins who never met, the same connected group of animals, moving with people, spread thin across half the known world, in an age when the fastest thing on Earth was a human walking. Whatever a dog was to these people, it was worth carrying that far. And it got there first. Dogs were the first animal we ever domesticated, before sheep, before cattle, before the goat, the pig, the horse. Every other tamed creature on Earth came after the dog. So when the first one crossed the gap and leaned toward a human fire, there was no template for what it was doing. There was no such thing yet as a domestic animal. The dog didn't join the category. The dog invented it. Which means the bond you feel is not a small, recent thing. It is the oldest relationship your species has with any other living creature, older than the field, older than the flock. Everything else we ever tamed, we tamed by copying a thing we first learned to do with a dog. Every farm, every barn, every animal that has ever fed a human city traces back through that one strange friendship struck in the dark before history began. Go back to that dog in Turkey for a second, the one at a place called Pınarbaşı. The chemistry locked inside its bones, the isotopes, the faint signature of what it ate, points to something almost tender. People were feeding it fish. Sit with that. A hunter-gatherer with no surplus, no granary, no promise of tomorrow's meal, chose to hand part of the catch to an animal, not scraps thrown out to rot at the tree line. Fish. The exact food they needed to stay alive. That is not a pet in the way you mean the word. It is something older and stranger. A partner worth feeding when you might go hungry yourself. So where did they all come from? Here the science gets honest and goes quiet. The exact time and the exact place that wolves became dogs are still debated. Nobody can point to one cave, one river, one morning and say it started here. But you don't need the birthplace to read the family tree. 27 ancient dog genomes, pulled from bones scattered across thousands of years, say one clear thing together. Every one of these dogs shares a common ancestry, and that ancestry is already separate from the wolves alive today. The split had happened. Deep in the Ice Age, the dog was already its own animal. And the line between dog and wolf, once it was drawn, mostly held. Since domestication, only a thin trickle of wolf blood ever flowed back into dogs. But it moved the other way in a flood. A substantial amount of dog ancestry flowed out into wolves. Read that twice. The wild wolves out there in the dark tonight carry pieces of the animal that chose the fire. Domestication didn't only change the dog, it leaked back into the wilderness and changed the thing the dog used to be. So there is no clean before and after. No sealed door between the tame world and the wild one. The dog didn't simply walk out of the wolf and shut it behind them. Some of what we softened flowed back out into the trees, until even the wolf was, in part, a little bit dog. That is what a real relationship does over thousands of years. It doesn't leave either side the way it found them. You don't get to be that close to another creature for that long and stay unchanged. By 11,000 years ago, still before most of the planet had ever seen a farm, dogs were no longer one kind of animal. At least 5 major lineages had already branched apart from each other. A dog line in the Levant, one up in Karelia near the cold Baltic forests, one deep in Siberia, out by Lake Baikal, one in the ancient Americas, and one that leads all the way to the New Guinea singing dog. 5 separate worlds of dog scattered across nearly every inhabited part of the map, and all of it before agriculture reshaped a single human life. Wherever we walked, the dog had walked there too, and stayed, and changed to fit. That is a staggering thing to picture. There was no age of humanity without dogs in it. By the time our ancestors were painting caves and burying their dead and spreading into empty continents, the dog was already at the edge of every one of those fires, on 5 different branches of its own tree, keeping pace with a species that had not yet learned to grow its own food. We tend to think we built our world and then invited the dog in at the end. As a reward, it's the other way around. The dog was in the room before the room had walls, which is the part that should stop you cold. Dog history mostly mirrors human history. Where people went, their dogs went, the two family trees running side by side like a river and its shadow. But not always. Sometimes the trees don't match. Sometimes humans moved and left their dogs behind them. And sometimes the dogs moved between human groups, passed and traded, and carried from one people to a different people entirely. Marsh and colleagues found exactly that. Dogs handed among human populations that were genetic and cultural strangers to one another. Magdalenian hunters, Epigravettian hunters, Anatolian hunter-gatherers. Different peoples, different tongues, different stone tools, reaching across the empty space between their worlds to give each other dogs. The dog may have been one of the first things a human ever offered to someone they otherwise shared nothing with. A token of trust, 10,000 years before anyone invented money. It's tempting to paint all of this warm. Ancient pets, curled by ancient hearths, loved exactly the way you love the one on your couch. Slow down. That is not what the bones say. The evidence points at something far messier and, honestly, more interesting. These were early domestic animals whose lives braided many things together at once. Scavenging at the ragged edge of camp, sharing in the food when there was food, moving with people across seasons and rivers and whole continents, working. And yes, forming real social bonds. Not a modern pet dressed in old fur. A scavenging, working, traveling, bonded creature living a kind of life we don't even have a clean word for anymore. Picture the actual day of it. No bowl, no collar, no warm house waiting. A dog that lived at the boundary of the human world, close enough to eat what fell from the fire, useful enough to keep around, free enough to still be half a wild thing. It read the camp. It knew who fed it and who didn't. It moved when the people moved, because staying meant starving. The relationship wasn't soft. It was a bargain, struck fresh every single day, between two animals who had both figured out they were stronger together than apart. And somewhere inside that hard bargain, again and again, something gentler kept slipping through. And then, sometimes, the bones say something you cannot explain away as usefulness. In Germany, at a place called Bonn-Oberkassel, there is a grave, 14,223 years old, give or take. Inside it lie two adult humans, and buried there with them, a dog. Young, barely past a juvenile. This dog was sick. Its remains carry damage in the mouth that fits severe illness, most likely canine distemper, a vicious virus that tears through young animals. A juvenile dog with distemper, out in the Ice Age, should have been dead in days. It wasn't. It lived long enough for the disease to leave its scars in the bone and then pass. And think about what that requires. An animal that's sick cannot survive on its own, not for a single night. Someone kept it warm through the fever. Someone carried water to it. Someone brought food to a creature that could do absolutely nothing for them in return. A sick young dog that couldn't hunt, couldn't guard, couldn't pull, couldn't work. They nursed it anyway. Through the worst of it. 14,000 years ago, by a fire we will never see. And when it finally died despite all of that, they laid it in the earth beside two of their own people. It was not a fluke. Further east, around 12,000 years ago, among the people we call the Natufians, a human was buried with a hand laid to rest against a puppy. Different land, different people, the same impossible impulse. Across the ancient world, over and over, humans put dogs into graves. Not discarded, not eaten, placed, given a burial, given the exact thing we reserve for our dead. The dog followed us into the hardest corners of the planet. On the coast of southeast Alaska, there are dog remains around 10,150 years old, sitting right inside the story of the first people edging down the frozen rim of the Americas into an empty continent. Where humans crept along that ice-locked coast, the dogs crept with them. And in the far north, by roughly 9,500 years ago, a specialized kind of dog had already emerged. Arctic dogs, shaped for the snow, the deep ancestors of the animals that would one day haul sleds across the white. The dog wasn't just tagging along for warmth, it had become a tool for surviving the exact places a human could barely survive at all. And that changes the shape of the whole human story. Some of the places we reached, we may only have reached because the dog reached them with us. It could smell the danger we couldn't. It could pull the weight we couldn't. It could survive the cold that would have stopped us at the tree line. When you look at a map of how far our ancestors spread, you are also looking at a map of how far the dog carried us. We didn't conquer the planet alone. We did it with something warm running beside us in the snow. Here's the last thing the bones remember, and this one is written straight into the genes. Most dogs alive today carry many copies of a gene for digesting starch. It's what lets them thrive on our food, on bread and grain and the leftovers of the harvest. But not every dog has it. Some dogs in Australia and in the Arctic carry few copies or none, and when you map out who has the gene and who doesn't, the pattern quietly traces the spread of prehistoric agriculture across the world, which flips the easy assumption on its head. The dog did not become a bread eater the instant it became a dog. That change came later. As we became farmers, our dogs became farmers' dogs, their own bodies rewriting themselves to match our fields. Where the plow reached, the starch-fed dog followed. Where it never reached, the older kind of dog stayed exactly as old as it always was. So the next time your dog watches you eat, understand what you're seeing. That patient stare at your dinner is not a habit it picked up in a modern kitchen. It is written into its blood, laid down over thousands of years, as its ancestors reshaped themselves cell by cell to live off the food our ancestors learned to grow. It changed its own body to stay at our table. We asked the dog to follow us out of the wild and all the way into the farmhouse, and its very genes said yes. So look down. The animal at your feet is not a modern invention, not a soft new comfort we dreamed up once life got easy. It is the far end of a line so long it runs clean off the edge of recorded history, past the first cities, past the first crops, back into the cold and the firelight, to hunter-gatherers who fed it fish they could not spare, and nursed it through fevers that should have killed it, and carried it between tribes who trusted nothing else about each other, and laid it in the ground beside their own dead. Everything else in your house is younger than the dog. It was here first. It watched us become every single thing we are, and it never once left.